Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue with readings from The Thurber Carnival by James Thurber. The Day the Dam Broke. My memories of what my family and I went through during the 1913 flood in Ohio, I would gladly forget. And yet, neither the hardships we endured nor the turmoil and confusion we experienced can alter my feelings toward my native state and city. I am having a fine time now and wish Columbus were here. But if anyone ever wished a city was in hell, it was during that frightful and perilous afternoon in 1913 when the dam broke. Or, to be more exact, when everybody in town thought that the dam broke. We were both ennobled and demoralized by the experience. Grandfather especially rose to magnificent heights which can never lose their splendor for me, even though his reactions to the flood were based upon a profound misconception, namely that Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry was the menace we were called upon to face. The only possible means of escape for us was to flee the house, a step which grandfather sternly forbade, brandishing his old army saber in his hand. "Let the sons of bitches come," he roared. Meanwhile, hundreds of people were streaming by our house in wild panic, screaming, "Go east! Go east!" We had to stun grandfather with the ironing board. Impeded as we were by the inert form of the old gentleman — he was taller than 6 feet and weighed almost 170 pounds — we were passed in the first half mile by practically everybody else in the city. Had grandfather not come to at the corner of Parsons Avenue and Town Street, we would unquestionably have been overtaken and engulfed by the roaring waters. That is, if there had been any roaring waters. Later, when the panic had died down and people had gone rather sheepishly back to their homes and their offices, minimizing the distances they had run and offering various reasons for running, city engineers pointed out that even if the dam had broken, the water level would not have risen more than 2 additional inches in the west side. The west side was, at the time of the dam scare, under 30 feet of water, as indeed were all Ohio River towns during the great spring floods of that time. The east side, where we lived and where all the running occurred, had never been in any danger at all. Only a rise of some 95 feet could have caused the floodwaters to flow over High Street, the thoroughfare that divided the east side of town from the west, to engulf the east side. The fact that we were all as safe as kittens under a cook stove did not, however, assuage in the least the fine despair and grotesque desperation which seized upon the residents of the east side when the cry spread like a grass fire that the dam had given way. Some of the most dignified, staid, cynical, and clear-thinking men in town abandoned their wives, stenographers, homes, and offices and ran east. There are few alarms in the world more terrifying than "the dam has broken." There are few persons capable of stopping to reason when that clarion cry strikes upon their ears, even persons who live in town no nearer than 500 miles to a dam. The Columbus, Ohio broken dam rumor began, as I recall it, about noon of March 12, 1913. High Street, the main canyon of trade, was loud with the placid hum of business and the buzzing of placid businessmen arguing, computing, wheedling, offering, refusing, compromising. Darius Coningway, one of the foremost corporation lawyers in the Midwest, was telling the Public Utilities Commission in the language of Julius Caesar that they might as well try to move the Northern Star as to move him. Other men were making their little boasts and their little gestures. Suddenly, somebody began to run. It may be that he had simply remembered all of a moment an engagement to meet his wife, for which he was now frightfully late. Whatever it was, he ran east on Broad Street, probably toward the Maramore restaurant, a favorite place for a man to meet his wife. Somebody else began to run, perhaps a newsboy in high spirits. Another man, a portly gentleman of affairs, broke into a trot. Inside of 10 minutes, everybody on High Street from the Union Depot to the courthouse was running. A loud mumble gradually crystallized into the dread word "dam." "The dam has broken!" The fear was put into words by a little old lady in an electric, or by a traffic cop, or by a small boy. Nobody knows who, nor does it now really matter. 2,000 people were abruptly in full flight. Go east was the cry that arose, east, away from the river, east to safety. Go east, go east, go east. Black streams of people flowed eastward down all the streets leading to that direction. In these streams, whose headwaters were all the dry goods stores, office buildings, harness shops, movie theaters, were fed by trickles of housewives, children, cripples, servants, dogs, and cats, slipping out of the houses past which the main streams flowed, shouting and screaming. People ran out, leaving fires burning and food cooking and doors wide open. I remember, however, that my mother turned out all the fires and that she took with her a dozen eggs and 2 loaves of bread. It was her plan to make Memorial Hall just 2 blocks away and take refuge somewhere in the top of it, in one of the dusty rooms where war veterans met and where old battle flags and stage scenery was stored. But the seething throngs shouting, "Go East," drew her along and the rest of us with her. When grandfather regained full consciousness at Parsons Avenue, he turned upon the retreating mob like a vengeful prophet and exhorted the men to form ranks and stand off the rebel dogs. But at length he too got the idea that the dam had broken, and roaring, "Go east!" in his powerful voice, he caught up in one arm a small child and in the other a slightly clerkish man of perhaps 42, and we slowly began to gain on those ahead of us. A scattering of firemen, policemen, and army officers in dress uniform — there had been a review at Fort Hays in the northern part of town — added color to the surging billows of people. "Go east!" cried a little child in a piping voice as she ran past a porch on which drowsed a lieutenant colonel of infantry. Used to quick decisions, trained to immediate obedience, the officer bounded off the porch and, running at full tilt, soon passed the child, bawling, "Go east!" The two of them emptied rapidly the houses of the little street they were on. "What is it? What is it?" demanded a fat, waddling man who intercepted the colonel. The officer dropped behind and asked the little girl what it was. "The dam is broken," gasped the girl. "The dam is broke." "The dam is broke," roared the colonel. "Go east, go east, go east." He was soon leading, with the exhausted child in his arms, a fleeing company of 300 persons who had gathered around him from living rooms, shops, garages, backyards, and basements. Nobody has ever been able to compute with any exactness how many people took part in the great rout of 1913, for the panic, which extended from the Winslow bottling works in the south end to Clintonville, 6 miles north, ended as abruptly as it began, and the bobtag and ragtail and velvet-gowned groups of refugees melted away and slunk home, leaving the streets peaceful and deserted. The shouting, weeping, tangled evacuation of the city lasted not more than 2 hours in all. Some few people got as far east as Reynoldsburg, 12 miles away. 50 or more reached the country club, 8 miles away. Most of the others gave up exhausted or climbed trees in Franklin Park, 4 miles out. Order was restored and fear dispelled finally by means of militiamen riding about in motor lorries, bawling through megaphones, "The dam has not broken." At first, this tended only to add to the confusion and increase the panic, for many stampeders thought the soldiers were bellowing, "The dam has now broken," thus setting an official seal of authentication on the calamity. All the time, the sun shone quietly, and there was nowhere any sign of oncoming waters. A visitor in an airplane looking down on the straggling, agitated masses of people below would have been hard put to it to divine a reason for the phenomenon. It must have inspired in such an observer a peculiar kind of terror, like the sight of the Marie Celeste abandoned at sea, its galley fires peacefully burning, its tranquil decks bright in the sunlight. An aunt of mine, Aunt Edith Taylor, was in a movie theater on High Street when, over and above the sound of the piano in the pit, a W.S. Hart picture was being shown, there rose the steadily increasing tromp of running feet. Persistent shouts rose above the tromping. An elderly man sitting near my aunt mumbled something, got out of his seat, and went up the aisle at a dog trot. This started everybody. In an instant, the audience was jamming the aisles. Fire! Shouted a woman who always expected to be burned up in a theater. But now the shouts outside were louder and coherent. The dam has broke, cried somebody. Go east, screamed a small woman in the front of my aunt. And east they went, pushing and shoving and clawing, knocking women and children down, emerging finally into the street, torn and sprawling. Inside the theater, Bill Hart was calmly calling some desperado's bluff, and the brave girl at the piano played Row, Row, Row loudly, and then In My Harem. Outside, men were streaming across the State House yard, others were climbing trees. A woman managed to get up onto the These Are My Jewels statue, whose bronze figures of Sherman, Stanton, Grant, and Sheridan watched with cold unconcern the going to pieces of the capital city. I ran south to State Street, east on State to 3rd, south on 3rd to Town, and out east on Town, my Aunt Edith has written to me. A tall, spare woman with grim eyes and a determined chin ran past me down the middle of the street. I was still uncertain as what was the matter in spite of all the shouting. I drew up alongside the woman with some effort, for although she was in her late 50s, she had a beautiful, easy running form and seemed in excellent condition. What is it? I puffed. She gave me a quick glance and then looked ahead again, stepping up her pace a trifle. Don't ask me, ask God, she said. When I reached Grant Avenue, I was so spent that Dr. H.R. Mallory, you remember Dr. Mallory, the man with the white beard who looks like Robert Browning? Dr. Mallory, whom I had drawn away from at the corner of 5th and Town, passed me. It's got us, he shouted, and I felt sure that whatever it was did have us, for you know what conviction Dr. Mallory's statements always carried. I didn't know at that time what he meant, but I found out later. There was a boy behind him on roller skates, and Dr. Mallory mistook the swishing of the skates for the sound of rushing water. He eventually reached the Columbus School for Girls at the corner of Parsons Avenue and Town Street, where he collapsed, expecting the cold, frothing waters of the Scioto to sweep him into oblivion. The boy on the skates swirled past him, and Dr. Mallory realized for the first time what he had been running from. Looking back up the street, he could see no signs of water, but nevertheless, after resting a few minutes, he jogged on east again. He caught up with me at Ohio Avenue, where we rested together. I should say that about 700 people passed us. A funny thing was that all of them were on foot. Nobody seems to have had the courage to stop and start his car, but as I remember it, all cars had to be cranked in those days, which is probably the reason. The next day, the city went about its business as if nothing had happened, but there was no joking. It was 2 years or more before you dared treat the breaking of the dam lightly. And even now, 20 years after, there are a few persons, like Dr. Mallory, who will shut up like a clam if you mention the afternoon of the Great Run. The night the ghost got in. The ghost that got into our house on the night of November 17th, 1915, raised such a hullabaloo of misunderstandings that I am sorry I didn't just let it keep on walking and go to bed. Its advent caused my mother to throw a shoe through a window of the house next door and ended up with my grandfather shooting a patrolman. I am sorry, therefore, as I have said, that I ever paid any attention to the footsteps. They began about a quarter past 1 o'clock in the morning, a rhythmic, quick cadenced walking around the dining room table. My mother was asleep in one room upstairs, my brother Herman in another. Grandfather was in the attic in the old walnut bed, which, as you will remember, once fell on my father. I had just stepped out of the bathtub and was busily rubbing myself with a towel when I heard the steps. They were the steps of a man walking rapidly around the dining room table downstairs. The light from the bathroom shone down the back steps, which dropped directly into the dining room. I could see the faint shine of plates on the plate rail. I couldn't see the table. The steps kept going round and round the table. At regular intervals, a board creaked when it was trod upon. I supposed at first that it was my father or my brother Roy who had gone to Indianapolis but were expected home at any time. I suspected next that it was a burglar. It did not enter my mind until later that it was a ghost. After the walking had gone on for perhaps 3 minutes, I tiptoed to Herman's room. Psst, I hissed in the dark, shaking him. Oh, he said in the low, hopeless tone of a despondent beagle. He always half suspected that something would get him in the night. I told him who I was. "There's something downstairs," I said. He got up and followed me to the head of the back staircase. We listened together. There was no sound. The steps had ceased. Herman looked at me in some alarm. I had only the bath towel around my waist. He wanted to go back to bed, but I gripped his arm. "There's something down there," I said. Instantly, the steps began again, circled the dining room table like a man running, and started up the stairs towards us, heavily, two at a time. The light still shone palely down the stairs. We saw nothing coming. We only heard the steps. Herman rushed to his room and slammed the door. I slammed shut the door at the stairs top and held my knee against it. After a long minute, I slowly opened it again. There was nothing there. There was no sound. None of us ever heard the ghost again. The slamming of the doors had aroused Mother. She peered out of her room. "What on earth are you boys doing?" she demanded. Herman ventured out of his room. "Nothing," he said gruffly, but he was in color a light green. "What was all that running around downstairs?" said Mother. So she had heard the steps too. We just looked at her. "Burglars!" she shouted intuitively. I tried to quiet her by starting lightly downstairs. "Come on, Herman," I said. "I'll stay with Mother," he said. "She's all excited." I stepped back onto the landing. "Don't either of you go a step," said Mother. "We'll call the police." Since the phone was downstairs, I didn't see how we were going to call the police, nor did I want the police, but Mother made one of her quick, incomparable decisions. She flung up a window of her bedroom, which faced the bedroom windows of the house of a neighbor, picked up a shoe, and whammed it through a pane of glass across the narrow space that separated the two houses. Glass tinkled into the bedroom occupied by a retired engraver named Bodwell and his wife. Bodwell had been for some years in a rather bad way and was subject to mild attacks. Most everybody we knew or lived near had some kind of attacks. It was now about 2 o'clock of a moonless night. Clouds hung black and low. Bodwell was at the window in a minute, shouting, frothing a little, shaking his fist. "We'll sell the house and go back to Peoria," we could hear Mrs. Bodwell saying. It was some time before Mother got through to Bodwell. "Burglars!" she shouted. "Burglars in the house!" Herman and I hadn't dared tell her it was not burglars but ghosts, for she was even more afraid of ghosts than of burglars. Bodwell at first thought she meant there were burglars in his house, but finally he quieted down and called the police for us over an extension phone by his bed. After he had disappeared from the window, Mother suddenly made as if to throw another shoe, not because there was further need of it, but, as she later explained, because the thrill of heaving a shoe through a window glass had enormously taken her fancy. I prevented her. The police were on hand in a commendably short time, a Ford sedan full of them, two on motorcycles, and a patrol wagon with about 8 in it and a few reporters. They began banging at our front door. Flashlights shot streaks of gleam up and down the walls, across the yard, down the wall between our house and Bodwell's. "Open up!" cried a hoarse voice. "We're men from headquarters." I wanted to go down and let them in, since there they were, but Mother wouldn't hear of it. "You haven't a stitch on," she pointed out. "You'll catch your death." I wound the towel around me again. Finally, the cops put their shoulders to our big heavy front door with its thick beveled glass and broke it in. I could hear a rending of wood and a splash of glass on the floor of the hall. Their lights played all over the living room and crisscrossed nervously in the dining room, stabbed into hallways, shot up the front stairs, and finally up the back. They caught me standing in my towel at the top. A heavy policeman bounded up the steps. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I live here," I said. "Well, what's the matter? You hot?" he asked. It was, as a matter of fact, cold. I went back to my room and pulled on some trousers. On my way out, a cop stuck a gun into my ribs. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I live here," I said. The officer in charge reported to Mother. "No sign of nobody, lady," he said. "Must have got away. What do you look like?" "There were 2 or 3 of them," Mother said, "whooping and carrying on and slamming doors." "Funny," said the cop. "All your windows and doors was locked on the inside, tight as a tick." Downstairs, we could hear the tromping of the other police. Police were all over the place. Doors were yanked open, drawers were yanked open, windows were shot up and pulled down, furniture fell with dull thumps. A half dozen policemen emerged out of the darkness of the front hallway upstairs. They began to ransack the floor, pulled beds away from walls, tore clothes off hooks in the closets, pulled suitcases and boxes off shelves. One of them found an old zither that Roy had won in a pool tournament. "Looky here, Joe," he said, strumming it with a big paw. The cop named Joe took it and turned it over. "What is it?" he asked me. "It's an old zither our guinea pig used to sleep on," I said. It was true that a pet guinea pig we once had would never sleep anywhere except on the zither, but I should never have said so. Joe and the other cop looked at me a long time. They put the zither back on the shelf. "No sign of nothing," said the cop who had first spoken to Mother. "This guy," he explained to the others, jerking a thumb at me, "was naked. The lady seems historical." They all nodded but said nothing, just looked at me. In the small silence, we all heard a creaking in the attic. Grandfather was turning over in bed. "What's that?" snapped Joe. 5 or 6 cops sprang for the attic door before I could intervene or explain. I realized that it would be bad if they burst in on Grandfather unannounced, or even announced. He was going through a phase in which he believed that General Meade's men, under steady hammering by Stonewall Jackson, were beginning to retreat and even desert. When I got to the attic, things were pretty confused. Grandfather had evidently jumped to the conclusion that the police were deserters from Meade's army trying to hide away in his attic. He bounded out of bed wearing a long flannel nightgown over a long woolen underwear, a nightcap, and a leather jacket round his chest. The cops must have realized at once that the indignant white haired old man belonged to the house, but they had no chance to say so. "Back, you cowardly dogs!" roared Grandfather. "Back to the lines, you goddamn lily livered cattle!" With that, he fetched the officer who found the zither a flat handed smack alongside his head that sent him sprawling. The others beat a retreat, but not fast enough. Grandfather grabbed Zither's gun from its holster and let fly. The report seemed to crack the rafters. Smoke filled the attic. A cop cursed and shot his hand to his shoulder. Somehow, we all finally got downstairs again and locked the door against the old gentleman. He fired once or twice more in the darkness and then went back to bed. "That was Grandfather," I explained to Joe, out of breath. "He thinks you're deserters." "I'll say he does," said Joe. The cops were reluctant to leave without getting their hands on somebody besides Grandfather. The night had been distinctly a defeat for them. Furthermore, they obviously didn't like the layout. Something looked, and I can see their viewpoint, phony. They began to poke into things again. A reporter, a thin faced, wispy man, came up to me. I had put on one of Mother's blouses, not being able to find anything else. The reporter looked at me with mingled suspicion and interest. "Just what the hell is the real lowdown here, bud?" he asked. I decided to be frank with him. "We had ghosts," I said. He gazed at me a long time as if I were a slot machine into which he had, without results, dropped a nickel. Then he walked away. The cops followed him, the one Grandfather shot holding his now bandaged arm, cursing and blaspheming. "I'm going to get my gun back from that old bird," said the zither cop. "Yeah," said Joe, "you and who else?" I told them I would bring it to the station house the next day. "What was the matter with that one policeman?" Mother asked after they had gone. "Grandfather shot him," I said. "What for?" she demanded. I told him he was a deserter. "Of all things," said Mother. "He was such a nice looking young man." Grandfather was fresh as a daisy and full of jokes at breakfast next morning. We thought at first he'd forgotten all about what had happened, but he hadn't. Over his third cup of coffee, he glared at Herman and me. "What was the idea of all them cops terry-hooting around the house last night?" he demanded. He had us there, and we'll hear more from the Thurber Carnival next time.